Today, we will talk about plant reproductive strategies. And what we see in the background of this slide is thyme. Thyme, the culinary herb used in, let's say, Italian or Mediterranean cooking. And you can see there's a huge mass of it here. This probably is all genetically identical and spread from one initial plant. And so this would be an example of asexual reproduction. Today we will talk about asexual reproduction, and we'll compare it to sexual reproduction. We will then talk about some different types of asexual reproduction. After that, we will switch gears and focus on sexual reproduction and talk about some different pollination strategies. We will talk about outcrossing or cross-pollination compared to self-pollination. We will talk about some different ways flower parts can be organized. So flowers can be perfect and have both stamens and pistils, or they can be imperfect and lack either stamens or pistils. Then we'll talk about 3 different plant sexes. This is more complicated than in humans and other mammals. So we can have hermaphrodites, where every flower has both pistils and stamen, or we can have monoecious plants that have some flowers that have only pistils and other flowers that have only stamen. Or we can have dioecious plants, where the entire plant has only pistils and other plants of that species have only stamen. We'll come back and talk about that in more depth. We'll start with asexual reproduction. The A prefix means without, and so this is reproduction without sex. Really what we're saying here is that there is no reduction division in the life cycle. Reduction division refers to when the chromosome count goes from being 2N or diploid down to being 1N or haploid. And this is something we've talked about earlier in the semester. When we say reduction division, that should bring to mind meiosis. They mean the same thing. So asexual reproduction does not have meiosis. It also does not have fertilization, because if we don't reduce the number of chromosomes, we cannot combine chromosomes from 2 different cells together. And so it's a much simpler life cycle. Really what happens in asexual reproduction is we get identical copies of the parent cell in the offspring. They've got the same number of chromosomes, but they also have exactly the same genes. And so their traits are going to be basically the same as the parent. And the only kind of cell division that will happen in asexual reproduction is mitosis. We will never have a reduction division, so we will never have meiosis. Let's contrast this with sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, of course, is much more complicated. In sexual reproduction, we do have that reduction division and we do have fertilization. And I think I can draw this. So at some point in the life cycle, if we imagine that we're dealing with a species that for simplicity just has 1 pair of homologous chromosomes in the diploid or the 2N state. So here's one parent plant that is going to make pollen. Here's another parent plant that is going to make an ovule. They're both diploid. In sexual reproduction, then we are going to get at some point a reduction division, and that can happen right here. In the reduction division, this in an angiosperm life cycle would be when we are making the spores that will eventually give us ovules or pollen. But during the reduction division, we are going to get 4 cells, each of which only gets 1 chromosome. This is meiosis. The important thing here is that these cells are all genetically different from one another. Some got this chromosome and some got this chromosome. And in a really simple case like this, it might seem like these 2 would be identical and these 2 would, but some things get more complicated as soon as cells have 2 or 3 or more pairs of chromosomes instead of just one. I just don't want to try to draw the more complicated case. So each of these is genetically unique. Now these are going to be the spores that will eventually, through some repeated rounds of mitosis, these are going to give us eventually an egg and an ovule, still haploid, or for this parent over here, this one also is going to go through meiosis. And I'm going to run out of space, but it would make 4 daughter cells. 1, 2, 3, and we'll just squeeze a 4th one in right here. These are all genetically distinct. These are all, again, spores. And the spores, again, are going to go through multiple rounds of mitosis, eventually forming a pollen grain with a sperm cell inside. And so this is our sperm cell inside a pollen grain. And this is our egg cell, which is part of the embryo sac inside an ovule. Eventually we'll get fertilization, and this sperm will reach the egg, and when it does, then its chromosome will enter, and we will be back to the diploid or the 2N state. What's important here is that because each of the spores made by meiosis in the female parent, because they're genetically different, and because each of the spores made by the male parent are genetically different, when we get fertilization happening, we will have lots of genetic diversity. We have, if we look over here, we have all eggs being unique, and we have all sperm in the pollen being unique. And then when we get them coming together, because a unique egg is fertilized by a unique sperm, we get even more genetic difference. And so in sexual reproduction, we will get seeds made that have many differences between them. Thus far then, we have asexual reproduction, which produces exactly genetically identical copies, and sexual reproduction, which produces genetically different copies. Let's think about the advantages of each. We'll start with asexual reproduction. What are its benefits? Well, it's very efficient. If you reproduce asexually, then the plant does not need to use materials to make large showy flowers, because there's no need to attract pollinators. There's no need to make nectar or pollen to attract pollinators. And so this is a savings of resources, that can be used to instead make more offspring. It's a faster process because the plant does not need to wait to make flowers, for example. It does not need to wait for pollinators to come, and it does not need to do everything that's complicated in terms of pollination and fertilization. It also allows reproduction without a partner. For animals, this is not as large of a problem, but for plants, because they can't move around, it's hard for them to find pollinators. Or rather, it's hard for them to find partners. They need to find a pollinator in order to do so, and that pollinator has to find another plant of the same species. And so for plants that are rare or isolated, they might not ever get pollen from a different individual. And so asexual reproduction can let them reproduce without the requirement for this. And another advantage to asexual reproduction is if the parent plant already has high fitness in its current environment, then so long as the environment does not change, the offspring should also have high fitness. So why mess with it if it works is sort of this final argument. That's 4 advantages then to asexual reproduction: efficiency, speed, being able to reproduce without pollinators or a partner, and maintaining fitness as high as the parent. But there are some advantages to sexual reproduction as well. Let's talk about those. we've already emphasized that sexual reproduction gives variable offspring. Some of those offspring are going to be less fit than the parents, so that's not a good thing. Evolution selects for higher fitness. But some of the new combinations of traits in the offspring will likely be better than what the parents had. And so we can think about this like a hill. And so if we just imagine here, we have some hill, and the hill is going to represent the relative fitness of the plants. And so high on the hill is better, low on the hill is worse. So this isn't a literal physical hill. And let's imagine the parent plants have some intermediate fitness, and so we'll represent that intermediate on the hill. Now, if the plants reproduce asexually, then the fitness of the offspring will be about the same. Not really higher, not really lower. If the plants reproduce sexually, then some of those offspring will have about the same fitness. Some of them will have lower fitness, which is bad, but some of them will have higher fitness. I'm not sure what happened there. So now these plants have higher fitness. Good, here we are again. So these plants higher on the hill, on the proverbial hill, have higher fitness. Then these plants are going to be the ones that tend to grow better and have more offspring. When they have offspring, their offspring's average fitness is going to be higher than their parents'. And so this is an evolutionary improvement compared to the parents'. That means that in sexual reproduction, we will tend to get, over time, an increase in fitness. You can imagine the same thing will happen when this plant has offspring, if it's through sexual reproduction. Some of its offspring will come back down the hill toward its parents, but some of them will continue up the hill, and the next generation would have even higher fitness. And so this will be favored by evolution. And so sexual reproduction can be favored, so long as plants can find a partner, for example. Now, another advantage of sexual reproduction is that if the environment changes, then some of the new combinations of traits in the offspring might be favored. So even if the combination of traits the parents had was pretty good, it might not be good under a new environment. And so by making many different offspring with many different combinations of traits, it's a way of hedging bets to make sure that at least some of your offspring will be able to survive in a changed environment. Similarly, the conditions for pests are constantly changing. And so even if there isn't some bad pest in this generation, there might be a bad pest in the next generation. And so again, by having offspring that have a wide variety of different traits, then at least some of those combinations of traits might let some of the offspring survive that disease or that pest. So because there is diversity with sexual reproduction, there can be advantages. Which strategy overall is better? That's sort of a rhetorical question. We can't strictly answer it. We can say a couple of things about it. First, most plants and most animals, at least most vertebrates, will have sexual reproduction. So that suggests that there's something valuable about sexual reproduction, despite its additional costs. Second, some animals and many plants, I think most plants, have methods for both sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Let's look at an example over here. What we have is a garlic scape. This is the top of a garlic stem that forms sort of mid-season, and typically we cut it off because we want the plant to make bigger garlic cloves instead of investing in this structure. But if we did allow this structure to grow, here's what we might see. We see a mix of bulbils, as well as flowers, and these flowers will eventually produce seeds. The key here is that these structures, the bulbils, are made asexually. These are made by mitosis, and they are genetically identical to the parent plant that made the stem. These will fall off the structure and can fall to the ground and establish new garlic plants. And in fact, some farmers will collect these and plant them to grow their next season garlic from these instead of using the garlic cloves, which they can then eat or sell. But so we have asexual reproduction here, but then we also have flowers, and these flowers are going to do the traditional production of ovules and pollen, and they will engage in sexual reproduction, and they will make seeds. So this is one plant doing both asexual reproduction and making seeds, which is sexual reproduction. So this garlic is basically telling us one strategy is not better than the other. Instead, they both have their advantages, and it can get higher fitness if it uses a mix of the two strategies. So let's move on and talk about some different strategies or some different methods plants use to reproduce asexually. One method are the bulbils that we just talked about with the garlic here. Another example of that are air potatoes. And so you might see these growing in natural areas around the Carolinas or nearby areas, Florida, for example. And this is an introduced vine from Asia, and these are relatives of yam. They're actually edible, but really they're mostly a pest for us. They are called air potatoes because they look like small potatoes in the air. And these can fall off the stems, land in the ground, and start new plants. This is asexual because these are made by mitosis without pollination, and they are genetically identical to the parent plant. We also can get formation of plantlets. So plantlets are, as the name implies, simply small plants made directly on the parent plant. And so there's a Chloe in the back here, and this has little plantlets on it. I'm going to show you in my live video down in the corner what this looks like. And so here's one of my houseplants, and most of these have now fallen off. But you can see on this lower leaf these small structures that are hanging off. These are made by mitosis, they're genetically identical to the parent, and they're made to fall off. As they continue developing, you'll sometimes even see roots form right on them before they fall off. If you take these, you can just deposit them on top of the soil, keep it moist, and they will grow into new plants. And so this plant is known as mother of thousands or mother of millions because it makes so many asexual offspring. Okay, and I'm just going to fix the spelling here and take out that extra L. So other ways that plants can reproduce asexually, we talked earlier in the semester about rhizomes, which are underground horizontal storage stems, stolons, which are above ground horizontal storage stems, as well as bulbs and things like onions and garlic. All of these can lead to asexual reproduction. Plants can also reproduce asexually by fragmenting. This literally means that part of the parent plant breaks off and establishes a new plant. And so we can see that again with the Kalanchoe. What I have here is another piece of the stem, and you can see that roots have formed, and each one of these pieces can break off and simply be planted in the soil and be its own new plant. We also get rerooting, and this is especially true for vine-like plants. Think about English ivy or poison ivy, for example, that just makes adventitious roots all along its stem. It will initially make one long plant, but if the stem eventually gets broken, those become separate plants. Finally, we can get root suckers forming. This is when shoots form off of existing roots. This is kind of the opposite of adventitious roots, where roots form on stems. Now we have stems forming on roots. Then those new stems come up and form new above ground plants. So what we see in this picture here is a clone of aspen trees. So this entire hillside here is thought to be one genetic individual with probably hundreds of separate trees. So really this can be thought of as just one plant. They are probably connected underground, at least to some degree. So that is 6 different methods of asexual reproduction: bulbils, plants, rhizomes, stolons, and bulbs, fragmenting, rerooting, and suckers. How do we as humans use plants for asexual reproduction? In a bunch of ways. So there's many food plants that really we grow without ever letting them go through a sexual life cycle. For example, potatoes. We start them from small tubers that grow into big ones, and then those plants make some new small tubers that we plant the next year. Same idea for onions. The onions make big bulbs that we eat, and then we harvest some small bulbs that we'll use for the next year. And we can split a head of garlic into separate cloves to plant. That's asexual. Asparagus makes rhizomes. We looked at that much earlier in the semester. And so we start new plants just by digging up rhizomes and then dispersing them elsewhere. And we've mentioned bulbs and tubers already with the onions and potatoes. For shrubs and trees, then we often start these by grafting, because we often want different roots than we want for the above ground parts. So many of our apple trees and peach or pear trees are grafted, as well as others. We talked about avocado in laboratory, for example. Many grapevines are also started by grafting a stem onto a root. This is still asexual reproduction. And then for plants that are used aesthetically in the garden, we'll oftentimes use cuttings. And you've probably done this laboratory now, where we made cuttings from coleus, and we also grafted coleus. That ends our conversation about asexual reproduction. For the rest of today's lecture, we will focus on sexual reproduction, and specifically on different kinds of pollination. And so when we have pollination, then we immediately want to know, are the plants being cross-pollinated or self-pollinated? Crossing and cross-pollination are just synonyms. And so let's define cross-pollination. This is when pollen moves from a flower on one individual to a carpel on another individual. And this is one individual here, the bees moving pollen over to this other plant. And sexual, or rather cross-pollination, is important because it is going to increase the genetic diversity of offspring. We talked at the start of this lecture about why we get more genetic diversity with sexual reproduction. But a big part of that was that we had a separate parent who's the male parent from the parent who's the female parent. And if cross-pollination happens, that's allowed. But if self-pollination, which we'll talk about next, happens, we would lose that huge benefit. Now, cross-pollination has some costs. It requires attracting pollinators. This pollinator is only going to come if it sees the flowers, so they need to be large and showy. But this pollinator also wants a reward, such as nectar, and so the plant will need to make some food for the pollinator. And so if pollinators are rare, because it's too cold, or because of human interference, or for some other reason, then cross-pollination will not happen. It could happen if it's a wind-pollinated species, But wind-pollinated species have another cost. They have to make a whole lot of pollen because wind is really inefficient at moving that pollen around. There's a very small chance it will reach another flower. To compensate for that, they make just much, much more pollen than insect-pollinated flowers. And so whether they are spending energy to attract pollinators or to make extra pollen, then they have to spend more if they are doing cross-pollination. We will contrast cross-pollination with self-pollination. Self-pollination is when a plant uses its own pollen on its own flowers. The most common way this can happen is if pollination occurs within a single flower or between flowers on the same, I misspoke. So the way this most typically happens is if pollen moves within a single flower. That's diagrammed here. We have pollen moving from the anthers to the stigma within the flower. But we could also have self-pollination between flowers. Let's imagine this flower is down here on the plant, and there's another flower up here on the plant. Then we could get pollen moving from one to the other. So from here, let's say, down to the stigma down here. Even though they're sort of different looking, genetically these are the same situation. It doesn't really matter genetically whether the pollen moves within a flower or between flowers on the same plant, because these two flowers on the same plant are genetically identical anyway. So whichever of these two ways self-pollination happens, there is going to be no increase in genetic diversity of the. So that's our last bullet point down here. We do not get increased genetic diversity as a result of self-pollination. In other words, this is pretty similar to asexual reproduction. But it's got some advantages. Isolated plants can still be pollinated if they can move pollen themselves, or if they get a pollinator that comes and moves pollen within a flower or between flowers on the same plant. And so this will not be as limiting as it is for outcrossing. Third, they can invest less in petals and nectar because it is less important to attract a lot of pollinators, and so they can save some energy and use it for other things. So just like sexual compared to asexual reproduction, there are advantages to cross-pollination and other advantages to self-pollination. What can plants do about this? Well, some plants do one, some plants do the other, and some plants do mixed mating, which refers to a combination of the two strategies, meaning cross-pollination and self-pollination. And so these plants have opportunities to cross-pollinate, especially if they get pollinator visits. For example, this monkey flower over here has an opening where pollinators can visit. It makes nectar, which is a reward for the pollinators. But these flowers also have the ability to self-pollinate. When the petals fall off, it actually causes the anthers to touch the stigma and self-pollination occurs. And so these plants sort of get the best of both worlds. They can cross-pollinate and get genetic diversity, but if that fails for some reason, they can self-pollinate and at least be assured of getting some pollen. We are going to move on now and talk about some other ways that plants control whether they self or cross-pollinate. To do this, we need to define the difference between perfect and imperfect flowers. Perfect flowers have both stamen and carpels. So we're not going to worry about petals and sepals. Those don't apply here. We're just going to focus on stamen and carpels. Remember, the stamen is the male part containing pollen, the carpel is the female part containing the ovule. Imperfect flowers, then, lack one of the two. They either lack stamen or they lack carpels. We will refer to the flowers lacking a pistil as staminate flowers because they have their stamen. We will refer to the flowers lacking stamen as pistillate flowers because they have the pistil. Remember, the pistil is just one or more carpels combined together. With that background, we can now talk about some different organizations. Hermaphrodites are the easiest. Hermaphrodites are plants that have perfect flowers. So all of the flowers have both the pistil and the stamen. And the advantage of this is it allows the plants to gain fitness both as a mother and as a father. So when the pollinator comes, it can bring pollen from another flower, pollinate the stigma. It can also pick up pollen and take it off to another flower elsewhere. So that's good, but there's a problem. Having both increases the chance for self-pollination. And if self-pollination occurs, that decreases the diversity of seeds. This could be good for mixed maters. If a pollinator does not come, maybe this flower can self-pollinate. So that could be an advantage. But if the plant really wants genetic diversity, then it prefers not to self-pollinate. So those are hermaphrodites. Now we're going to focus on plants with imperfect flowers. And there's two different ways plants can organize imperfect flowers. The first is being monoecious. So the word monoecious means one house. And really what this is saying is that there's one plant that contains both flower types. And corn can be our example here. So on corn we have separate pistillate and staminate flowers. This ear of corn here has many, maybe a few hundred pistillate flowers. Each one is going to develop into one kernel. And up here at the top we have the tassels, but the tassels are collections of many, many staminate flowers that make pollen but do not have carpels. So this is monoecious because we have both the female flowers and the male flowers on the same plant. I should really be saying pistillate flowers and staminate flowers on the same plant, but each individual flower is imperfect. Why is this a good arrangement? Well, it eliminates the possibility of self-pollinating within a flower. It could still self-pollinate from the staminate flowers to the pistillate flowers on the same plant. So all self-pollination is not avoided, but it increases the chance that a neighboring plant will become the pollen parent for the female flowers instead. So we are increasing at least the chance of cross-pollination. Finally, we can have dioecious plants. Dioecious literally means two with the di, and the ecious, I think, is Greek for house. So this is two houses. And here we have two entirely separate plants. One plant is male and makes only staminate flowers. The other is female and makes only pistillate flowers. An example of this is mulberry. So you know the children's song about the mulberry bush. We actually have mulberry trees here, and these are mulberry fruits. They look kind of raspberry-like. They are edible and they are fairly good tasting once they are ripe. So what you'll find though is not all mulberry trees make mulberry fruits. Instead, some make only staminate or male flowers, and then other mulberry trees make pistillate flowers, and those are the ones that will make the fruit. So the arrangement of being dioecious, two houses, this is what we're used to for both humans and other mammals. We have female individuals or we have male individuals. And the advantage of this in terms of reproduction is this completely eliminates the possibility of self-pollination, because where the pollen's made, there are no flowers with pistils to receive the pollen and vice versa. And so that is an advantage for genetic diversity, but it does mean that either wind pollination has to happen or there have to be pollinators available to move pollen from the males to the females. In other words, for dioecious plants, it can be harder to find a mate. Let's wrap up with some final thoughts. First, there is a trade-off between asexual and sexual reproduction. We talked about several advantages for both of these. We also talked about the fact that many plants do both. They make seeds, but they also use one or more of the different ways that we talked about for asexual reproduction. Next, there are trade-offs between sexual reproductive strategies. For example, selfing compared to outcrossing. There are advantages to this and disadvantages to both, and different arrangements like being monoecious, dioecious, or hermaphroditic. There are again some advantages and disadvantages to each of those strategies. The fact that there's not one clear best strategy is reflected in the fact that we can find some plants using one strategy and other plants using other strategies. And the last thought I'll leave you with is that when we garden or when we engage in farming or horticulture, we need to know about the sexual system. For example, if we plant female plants, we need to make sure we plant a male plant too, otherwise the female plant will not get pollinated. Additionally, there are some species, ginkgo for example, which we talked about earlier in the semester, where the reproductive structures on the females are really quite messy. And in those situations, maybe we don't want the plants to reproduce at all, and we would prefer just to plant male plants so we don't get fruits like mulberry fruits where we don't want them, or the fleshy ginkgo cones where we don't want those. And so it's worth looking into when you plant whether the plants need a partner or whether they are able to pollinate and fertilize themselves.